Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala sayyidil mursaleen. Wa ala alihi wa sahabati ajma'in. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana. Innaka antal alimul hakim. Subhanaka la fahma lana illa ma fahamtana. Innaka antal jawadul karim. Qul rabbi zidni ilma. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. يسألونك عن الخمر والميسر قل فيهما إثم كبير ومنافع للناس وإثمهما أكبر من نفعهما صدق الله مولانا العظيم. So continuing the narrative of the prohibition of wine and gambling. And so we talked a little bit about the general meaning of the ayat, that they were asking Rasulullah concerning these two social vices and evils, which are very corruptive and very destructive in society. Wine, intoxicants. And when wine is mentioned, obviously, any type of intoxicants, which is the protection of one's intellect, is one of the major concerns of Sharia. Protection of one of, as we say, the maqasid of Sharia, protection of the mind, protection of the intellect, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has distinguished man above the rest of his creation. So wine and other intoxicants which, disrupt the intellectual process and hamper the intellectual, the brain and the thinking process are obviously things to be avoided. And gambling, of course. And we'll talk a little bit more about gambling and its evils and its consequences and what it entails as well. And so it's mentioned that, say that there is a great sin in these things, and there is also some perceived and some real benefits. For example, the earning that is involved in these things, and some other perceived benefits, and most of it is actually figments of people's imagination. In any case, so we talked about the context of the nuzul of this ayat, or the revelation of this particular ayat, and that some of the individuals, some of the Sahaba, like Rasulullah himself, as we mentioned, he was never comfortable with any of these type of practices, and he would abstain, and he disdained such practices from the very beginning by his own fitrah and his own isma, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected him by. And there were also individuals in society that also, perceive the reality that these are vices and they need to be dealt with, they need to be eradicated. And so they asked Rasulullah about that, and as we mentioned yesterday, Rasulullah cannot forbid anything by his own. He has to, he can only implement the tashri'ah, the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which ultimately came in this ayat. They ask about the khamr, say there is some benefit, but the sin and the evil far outweighs it. So we want to talk a little bit today about the nature of legislature in Islam, which is quite different than legislature in the secular states like we see here in the United States or anywhere else. So in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants Islam. He wants people to submit. Submission is not coercion. Submission is knowingly, willingly, lovingly, intellectually, emotionally submitting. Right? So legislature, passing laws, does not bring about this mind and heart set. Therefore, I contend that legislature has never changed human behavior. It can, to some extent, seek to control human behavior, but it doesn't change human behavior. Human behavior is changed by three things: da'wat, ta'lim, and tarbiyah. And therefore every prophet was sent into this world with these three efforts. And therefore Nabi ﷺ, in two ayats it's mentioned, وَالَّذِي بَعَثَ فِي الْأُمِّيِّينَ رَسُولًا مِّنْهُمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِهِ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as he did the former prophets. inviting them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, teaching them the commandments and orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and preparing their minds and hearts with tarbiyah, nurturing them to accept and love and respect and want to follow those orders. And this is a sustainable methodology. Simply passing laws is unsustainable because you can control people for a while until they rebel. The classic example of that is the prohibition in this country. Back in the 1920s, we have an era which is known as the Roaring Twenties. Have you ever heard of that? The Roaring Twenties. You don't know about that? Yeah, so you should know about that. That was a time roaring. Why was it called the Roaring Twenties? Well, number one, it was roaring in economic progression because it was a very economically, active era up until the time of the Great Depression. It was also roaring with the fire of machine guns. If you think of Pakistan and Palestine and all of these places, it's very chaotic. It was as chaotic, if not more, here in this country in the 1920s. Because why? Because the legislation was improperly, they tried to implement a legislature which they had not prepared the minds and hearts to accept. So the government actually came to the conclusion, just as the Quran says, that this wine and intoxicants are a social evil. It's disrupting the individual, and it's disrupting families, and it's disrupting the society. So they passed a law from tomorrow, wine, alcohol, forbidden. The problem is they didn't prepare the minds and the hearts to accept that. So do you think anybody actually accepted that legislature? Few. And this is where the mafia started. You've all heard of the mafia, right? Where did that start? It started with prohibition. So with the initiative was proper. It was sound. The methodology was faulty. So rather than bringing about the desired result, it brought about what we call in Arabic radd al-fi'l, an adverse reaction. So rather than, taking this, legislature to heart and mind, saying, yeah, this is better for us and let's do it, we said, no, how do we circumvent it? Just like taxes. People feel that we need to support the country, they're going to willingly pay taxes. If they think we don't need to support the country, we're going to circumvent. We're going to find ways, loopholes to get out of it. So similarly, this is what happened here. So now the mafia started. What happened? They started making wine and intoxicants and alcohol, whiskey, etc., in their cellars and underground, under their houses. And they would sell it to their friends and their neighbors, and their business expanded, and then the turfs expanded, and then this family started, that family started, and then you had the wars between these various families simply over, market share. Eliminate your competition. Have you ever heard of that in business? So this was literally eliminate your competition, literally, And this is what was going on until finally it got so terrible that they decided, well, we're going to have to just, leave this because it's not going to work. But by that time, already this mafia had established itself, and, they had, made themselves millionaires in crime. And so, okay, fine, now let's go into other things. So then they went into drugs, they went into pornography, etc. And then rather than becoming millionaires, they became billionaires and trillionaires, right? So the Sharia of Islam, doesn't enforce rules that people are not prepared to accept. We call it tadrij fit tashriya, incrementally preparing the minds and the hearts to accept. And now how that process took place, inshallah, tomorrow we'll talk about that in detail. Wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen wa assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.